Hey, Mom, get me a beer. Huh? Nancy? Are you going deaf all of a sudden? You can hear me, right? Hey. I said get me a beer. This is how my son and his wife always call out to me. It's been 5 years since we started living together, and they have never listened to me. The rare times they talk to me, it's always just orders like these. Alternating between my son's wife, Sarah, loudly insulting me, and my son, John, treating me like a maid. I pretended not to hear them and continued to watch TV with my back to them. I was at my wit's end with the two of them ignoring me except when they needed something. After ignoring them for a while, Sarah grabbed the remote and turned off the TV I was watching. When I looked up in surprise, she yelled loudly in my ear. Nancy. Can you hear me? Make lunch for John tomorrow. Got it? The loudness of her voice made me wince. Seeing my reaction, she laughed and said, looks like she heard, then left the living room with John. Even though I was her mother-in-law and she often relied on me, she didn't seem to show any consideration. Watching John's behavior, it seemed I was no more than a maid to both of them. They never apologized, and I never felt any consideration from them. With a heavy sigh, I sent an email to my husband and decided to leave the house. My name is Nancy. I'm 72 years old this year. 5 years ago, my son and his wife asked if they could save money by living with us, so we started living together. Mom, wouldn't it be more reassuring to live with us? Well, maybe so. My husband, a workaholic who started his own company in his youth, is still working at 73. With John gone, the house had always felt quiet. Even when I consulted my husband about living together, he just said, do as you like. Because of that, we didn't talk much, and I felt a bit lonely. I agreed to live with my son's family, hoping it would bring some liveliness. That was why I agreed to live with them. At first, Sarah and I shared the household chores. However, she told me my part-time job is getting busier, and gradually, I ended up taking on more and more responsibilities. She would occasionally help, but always with a sigh, and on her days off, she would go out or laze around in her room. So, I stopped asking her for help. I ended up doing all the housework, and it became the norm. I grew tired of not being appreciated. Even during family meals, there was almost no conversation. When they did talk, it was just to ask for tea or beer, treating me like a servant. They wouldn't greet me when we met in the house, and they only talked to me when they needed something. I had hoped for a lively, fun life, but I found myself sighing more as I looked at the same quiet living room. Thinking back, it had always been like that with my husband too, so maybe I was quite numb to it. One day, while making dinner for the three of them as usual, I received an email from my husband saying, I'll be late because of work. I don't need dinner. That was not unusual, but the problem was my son and his wife. Dad's late tonight? I don't need dinner either. Oh. I'm going out with friends, so I don't need dinner. Why are you telling me now? I've already made it. So what? We'll eat it tomorrow, so just leave it. Even though it was dinner time, they looked like they were about to leave without saying a word. And when I called out to them, this was how they responded. They didn't bother to inform me about things that didn't inconvenience them. When I complained about their rude behavior, they left without any remorse. Why do I even bother? In the silent living room, I stared at the wasted dinner I had prepared and felt blank. What am I even doing here? Thinking about it all made me feel utterly exhausted. I wrapped the still warm dinner, put it in the fridge, and went straight to bed. The next morning, when I went down to the living room, my husband, who was already up, apologized, sorry about last night. It was the usual brief exchange. But this time, he looked at my face, furrowed his brows slightly, and asked, did John and Sarah not eat dinner either? Huh? Oh, yes. They suddenly said they didn't need dinner and went out. I see. He must have seen the 3 portions of dinner in the fridge. Feeling pleased with this rare conversation, I told my husband about last night. He silently listened for a while. After hearing me out, he finally said, you don't have to push yourself. Their attitudes are getting worse by the day. But if I don't take care of the house, no one else will. That doesn't mean you have to overwork yourself. His words made me feel like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I realized I had been pushing myself too hard, and I was grateful that my husband understood. John and Sarah aren't little kids anymore, so there's no need for me to work so hard. When I thought that, it felt like a fog had lifted from my vision. I might be late again because of work, so I don't need dinner tonight either. Okay. This time, I nodded with a smile at his words. Tonight, I'll make sure John and Sarah understand. With that resolve, I saw my husband off to work on a Sunday and decided to stand up to my son and his wife. After my husband left, they finally woke up around noon. They came into the living room still in their pajamas and asked me, "What's for lunch?" "There's the dinner you didn't eat last night." "Why don't you eat that?" "That's fine, but you could at least warm it up or put it on the table for us." "You're not little kids. Do it yourself." "Come on, Nancy. You're so old, aren't you?" Sarah laughed at me, mocking me. John joined in, laughing and looking at me as well. Even though they're not at an age where their parents should do everything for them, they still ate the food I made and complained about me. "Well, Sarah, since you stopped helping with the housework, I'm really tired." "Oh, can't manage without me? Are you going through menopause or something?" She laughed mockingly, as if to say, tit for tat. I could only sigh at her attitude. Even after they finished eating, they didn't clean up and just went back to their room, not caring at all. That night, as expected, my husband didn't come home until late. Since I didn't need to prepare his dinner, I bought some deli food for myself from the supermarket. "Huh? Mom, what are you eating?" "Deli food." "What about our dinner?" "I don't know." "What are you thinking, Nancy? Have you forgotten about the family?" Does she really need to be sarcastic to have a conversation? Her attitude was so terrible that I decided to stop responding to her. John kept complaining to me for a while, but when I ignored him, he gave up and took out his phone. "Mom, you're not working, so at least take care of the house. It's your day off. You can take care of your own meals for once." Just as I was thinking that, they decided to order delivery. When they said, "Give us money for it later," I got really irritated. I hadn't said anything about them not paying for living expenses because they initially claimed they wanted to save money. But now, to be spoken to like this after all I've done for them, I couldn't stand it. Even though he's my son, I couldn't tolerate such arrogant behavior. So I decided to do nothing for them and completely ignore them as a form of retaliation. "Hey, Mom, get me a beer." "Huh? Nancy? Are you going deaf all of a sudden? You can hear me, right?" "Hey. I said get me a beer." Sarah loudly insulted me, while John treated me like a maid, taking turns raising their voices. Ignoring them, I continued to watch TV with my back to them, pretending not to hear. After a while, when they realized I wasn't responding, they stopped talking to me. But that didn't last long. Sarah, who had come behind me without my noticing, grabbed the TV remote and turned it off. When I looked up in surprise, she yelled loudly in my ear. "Nancy. Can you hear me? Make lunch for John tomorrow. Got it?" The loudness of her voice made me wince. Seeing my reaction, she laughed and said, "Looks like she heard," and left the living room with John. Even though I was her mother-in-law and she often relied on me, she didn't seem to show any consideration. Watching John's behavior, it seemed I was no more than a maid to both of them. They never apologized for last night's dinner, and I felt indifferent towards them. With a heavy sigh, I sent an email to my husband and decided to leave the house. The next morning, I packed my things early and left the house before they woke up. At a nearby business hotel, I started receiving a barrage of emails from John, who must have woken up just before heading to work. Apparently, they were both in a panic from the morning. My phone quickly filled with notifications from emails and missed calls from both of them. When I opened the emails, they were filled with complaints like, "What are you doing? I told you I needed lunch." Sarah's messages included sarcastic remarks like, "Have you forgotten what you're supposed to do? Where are you wandering off to?" They seemed so troubled just because they didn't have breakfast prepared, which made me laugh. During his lunch break, John called again, so I finally decided to answer. Finally. "Mom, where are you and what are you doing?" "That's my business, isn't it? I'm asking why you didn't prepare the meals. John, you're not a child. You can make your own meals, can't you? If they were so troubled by one missed meal, they should have shown some gratitude instead of complaining. When I pointed this out, he said something unexpected. We're paying living expenses, so you should be taking care of the house. Living expenses? What are you talking about? I've never received anything. What? That's impossible. Sarah gives it to you every month, so don't lie. He insisted that he was paying me living expenses. Of course, I had never received any money, so I honestly told him that, but he called me a liar. There's no lie, all their food and other expenses come from my husband's salary. No matter how many times I explained this, he refused to believe me. I could hear Sarah in the background saying, she's probably just pretending and spending it all herself. It was pointless to argue. So I interrupted them and said, I don't know anything about that. And I don't plan on coming back for a while. What? What about our meals? Figure it out yourselves. Goodbye. I hung up the phone and let out a big sigh. Even after everything, they still believed they were not at fault. I couldn't understand what John meant about the living expenses. Things began to improve about a week after I left. My husband visited to check on me and talked to John and Sarah. Their emails suddenly became more polite and remorseful. Wondering what had happened, I received an email from my husband. They want to apologize. Come back if you feel like it. It seemed that talking to my husband had finally made them understand. I replied to his email and decided to pack up and go back home that day. When I got home, I was greeted by John and Sarah at the entrance. They looked exhausted. Apparently, my husband's scolding had a significant impact. I sat down with John, Sarah, and my husband to hear what had happened over the past week. So, about that living expenses thing you mentioned on the phone. I told you I didn't receive any money, didn't I? I didn't say anything because you said you wanted to save money. Actually, Dad was furious with me about that. John had told his father that he was paying living expenses. He believed I was lying, so he explained to his father that it was all my fault. However, my husband showed him the household accounts and explained how busy I was from morning to night with cleaning, shopping, and cooking for the three of us. John suddenly became quiet. Didn't you realize that? Well, Sarah kept saying she gave you the money every month. So? What happened to the living expenses? I used them. John had been sure the money was being paid, so he was bewildered that it wasn't reaching me. So, my husband and John confronted Sarah and made her confess. At first, she tried to play dumb, but when my husband shouted at her, she finally confessed everything. I was surprised to hear this, as I had never seen him shout before. Apparently, she needed money to go out for meals and trips with her coworkers. She admitted in a small voice that she had been using the money to go to expensive restaurants and keep up appearances. Pocketing any leftover money. How ridiculous. On the phone, you accused me of squandering money, but it was just you projecting your own behavior. Well, my friends were worried that living with in-laws is stifling, so when they invited me out, I just went along. Using our living expenses for that? You've embarrassed me because of this. You were acting all high and mighty too. Just as their argument started to veer off topic, my husband cleared his throat loudly. The two of them, obviously scared of him, jumped and fell silent immediately. Their behavior was so childish that I couldn't help but laugh. Stop this nonsense. The first thing you should do is sincerely apologize. Dad, I was tricked by Sarah too. Does that justify your attitude towards your mother? Neither of you has apologized to her since she got back. I'm sorry. Finally, they apologized to me. But even then, John continued to make excuses, saying he had been taking advantage of the fact that it was his own home. Work has been getting busier, and I just wanted to relax at home. And what about your mother, who has to deal with her grown son and his wife taking advantage of her and disrespecting her in her own home? He had no response to his father's cutting words. Sarah, who had taken my husband's quiet demeanor for granted, had also learned a hard lesson. She looked more frightened than John. Seeing their somewhat repentant but still dissatisfied expressions, I decided to make sure they truly understood. I'm truly disappointed in you for trying to rely on your mother at your age. And Sarah, for embezzling the money meant for household expenses. Mom. We're sorry. We're apologizing, aren't we? Do you think apologizing will fix everything? Show some real remorse. They thought that just apologizing would smooth everything over, so they hurried to make excuses in response to my words. But I could see right through their intentions. So I shook my head. It doesn't matter if you're paying living expenses, your behavior was unacceptable. You need to learn to appreciate what you have. But aren't you worried about the future too, Nancy? Yes, and having people like you take care of me only makes me more anxious. There's no need to say it like that. I can't allow the stress of living with in-laws to lead to embezzling living expenses again. Realizing that I was no longer willing to listen to their excuses, they finally quieted down. They needed to relearn how disrespectful their actions were by living on their own. And so, we were able to separate from them. My work is no excuse, but I'm sorry for not noticing until things got this bad. In the end, even my husband apologized to me. I never had any complaints about him. In fact, I was grateful that he helped resolve the situation. We promised to set aside more time to talk as a couple from now on. Later on, Sarah started coming to our house occasionally to learn how to do housework from me. At first, I thought she was just trying to make amends, but it turned out she was complaining that John didn't help with any chores. Having always put on airs at her part-time job, she now had no one else to confide in. I now realize how much I depended on you, Nancy. Indeed. And yet, you had the nerve to say I was going deaf and squandering money. Having lost the freedom to spend as she liked and with her part-time job salary now restricted to make up for what she had misused. Sarah often lamented her situation. But to me, it was clear she was simply reaping the consequences of her past behavior. She would leave quickly before my husband came home, indicating that his scolding still had a significant impact. As for my husband, he occasionally brought home delicious treats as a gesture of appreciation. He would still mention from time to time that he regretted not being more considerate. I knew he was a man of few words and a workaholic. Still, during the conversation with our son and his wife, it meant a lot to me that he acknowledged my efforts. Thank you for all your hard work. I appreciate it. Yeah. It was good to have these talks with him again. I deeply felt the truth of the saying, after rain comes fair weather. No matter how it came about, our days are now more peaceful and happier than before.